Welcome. Thank you for coming. Art Basel, Miami Beach. Discussion about Sarah Thornton's new book, 33 Artists in 3 Acts, moderated by András Santos, author, also an author, and a cultural consultant. Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hi. Well, welcome. We're going to have a lot of fun. We hope you'll have a lot of fun. We're here to talk about artists, and the reason why we're here is Sarah's new book, 33 Artists in 3 Acts. I hope at least 33 of these books will be sold today. Actually, are they for sale?
They are.
They are?
Yeah, and I'd be delighted to sign them.
Great. So, for those of you who don't know, well, I'll get to Sarah in a minute. But we're going to have a kind of a improvised, not so improvised conversation about artists, because this is a book about artists. And I think in the midst of this frothy commercial art market activity that we're in the midst of, it's good to be reminded that we're all here because of artists. And if you want to learn more about artists, buy this book. So let me quickly introduce my illustrious interlocutors. Massimiliano Gioni probably needs little introduction. His current title is Artistic Director of the New Museum. You probably have been following his many, many acclaimed exhibitions, his stellar Venice Biennale last year, his collaboration with Maurizio Cattelan, and I should also add he's the chairman of the jury for the Absolute Art Awards, which happens to also have an award for art writing. So that completes the circle in that respect. Sarah Thornton, my great friend, is of course a writer and a sociologist based in London. How many of you might have read her previous book, 7 Days in the Art World? Okay. I used to teach people going into the art business, and this was one of the required readings of the course, and I think it's probably true for many courses. There are not many books which are accessible and legible and precise, which give you an introduction into how the art world works. She has also been the chief art correspondent for The Economist. She's written for all the major publications, spoken at all the major events, and now here she is with this new book. I, as someone who also has a background in sociology, I just want to say thank you, Sarah, for making sociologists proud. You've done the sort of shoe leather reporting and research that is the hallmark of your ethnography. And you've given us a window now into the world of artists. It's a delicate balancing act. It's personal, but it's analytical. It's accessible, but it's not lightweight. It sort of adds to our understanding, and that's a good thing for a book. So, hey. But more importantly, you in this book try to answer a question that is very urgent, actually, which is what is an artist? What is an artist today? And like any good sociologist, you subscribe to a fairly unsentimental view of the artist. You are not a romantic. You see the artist as being engaged in a variety of pursuits, not just creating that work, but also speaking at the panel, educating, dealing with dealers, collectors. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that in this book, when you read about the work, what is being referred to is not the artwork, but the work of the artist, the very complex and multi-layered activity of fashioning a persona and a kind of social role of an artist. So this is a complex image, and what I'd like to propose for us to do today in a minute is to look at the many ways in which the role of the artist is defined in this book. And we'll get to that in a second, but I thought to sort of clear our throats, I would ask both of you to just very, 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 very briefly say, and you'll get the first word, what is the key message of this book? What is the main message of this book for you?
Well, I think artists are mystified in our culture. Art needs its myths. but some myths are not very credible nowadays. A lot of people are bewildered about how art arrives into museums, and I think the object or the work itself in the strict sense is the most important thing, but it's not the only thing. And if you understand the entire way a living artist plays their game, you're much more likely to understand how that work's arrived in a museum.
And Sarah, some of the readers, your faithful readers who are here, know that probably when you sort of went off to write this book, you very publicly sort of broke away from reporting on the art market. Maybe say a little bit about how this book figures into this larger decision on your part to move sort of beyond this area where you really carved out a big niche as a leading art world reporter.
Well, when I finished 7 Days in the Art World, I felt like there were two things I wanted to understand better. One was the art market, and the other was artists. And I started researching them at the same time. I ended up writing 65 articles for The Economist, many of them about the market, and at the same time researching this book. I kind of burnt out my interest, I guess, in reporting in the strict sense on the market. I actually am fascinated by the market, and I really respect those people doing great investigative pieces. I felt a little frustrated by being positioned as a reporter, because sometimes you end up being kind of a cheerleader for high prices, and it's very hard to investigate the opacity of auctions in particular. I think I'm a lover of art fairs more than auctions for a lot of reasons. One, artists actually see some profits from what's going on this week at Art Basel. There's primary work on sale. And also, a fair is opaque. We all know it is. It's transparently opaque, whereas the auctions kind of are theatrical spectacles that pretend to be transparent when they aren't at all. There's chandelier bidding and third-party guarantees and all sorts of things like that.
So I think one of the things that comes through in this book when you read it is you were having a lot of fun in the last few years meeting all these artists and hanging out with them, right?
I believe in having fun.
And on that
I certainly
note,
want to give my reader a good time. So if anything was really not fun, I left it out.
So Massimiliano, just a snapshot of what you think this book is really all about.
Well, the main reason why I like the book is that I'm featured in it, and
Of course.
and that makes it worth reading. Irony aside, I think it's there are a few reasons why I'm interested in this book and interested in Sarah's work. One is that also with her previous book, she's acquired a great balance between being divulgative and informative and still staying true and close to her subject matter. And secondly, I still dream that somebody will come and write the definitive sociology of art. I've always been, as a kid growing up, a fan of the 4 volumes of Arnold Hauser, Sociology of Art, which became more and more unfashionable, famously after the Ernest Gombrich review, in which he said that the book suffered from a form of physiognomic fallacy, which is one of my favorite way to dismiss a book. So basically the claim was that the book, the Sociology of Art, confused the style with the values, to simplify, of the audience and the participants of a certain historical moment. But so I've been hoping and dreaming that a definitive sociology of contemporary art will come around, and a book that could describe also what we're doing here today, not here on this stage, but here behind this wall. And I don't know if Sarah will be the one to write it, but I think she's getting very close to it.
Did you recognize these artists? I mean, I think you probably know almost every single artist in this book. Did you recognize them?
Yes, yesterday actually I was having dinner with Marta Rosler, who was in front, and I asked her, so did you read the book? And she said, yes, I wanted to sue Sarah because she said I have dead plants in my studio. And she was obviously joking.
Did she tell you that?
Yeah.
She did threaten to sue me, actually.
But she said
now that she said that, I can say it too.
He was saying that it was because of the dead plants, nothing else.
But yeah, principally, she's very touchy about her green thumb. And it's amazing how you can upset an artist if you touch their sore point. And
she was actually very
and
nice.
she's absolutely right. I was fact-checking the scene, and I had referred to like a row of dead spider plants. And she said they were just in need of a prune.
No, she was actually very funny and not.
I love Martha's scene. She kind of blasts. She's, I think, the kind of climax of Act 1 is 33 artists in 3 acts. Act 1 is called Politics. Act 2 is Kinship. Act 3 is Craft. And it's set up with antagonisms. So in Act 1, my key recurring characters are Ai Weiwei and Jeff Koons. So there's a play back and forth between these two artists, and other artists come in and have their say. And then for me, Martha kind of, comes in towards the end of that act and just like clears the air.
Well, first of all, I'm so happy you mentioned Arnold Hauser, a Hungarian sociologist of art, because I'm also, as it happens, Hungarian and a sociologist of art. Maybe one day we'll have time for 4 volumes. If you could write like a half-volume sociology of art, that would be much better for our times. But in that spirit, let us proceed in that spirit. And I have, and Sarah said she won't sue me for doing this, but I have done my own little analysis of Sarah's book. Because in this book, there are, 50 chapters, and in many of these chapters, she asks her question, which is, what is an artist? And as I was reading the answers, I realized that they actually cluster into 4 archetypes, or 4 mythologies, if you will, which sort of add up to a kind of meta system on top of your book. And I hope that today we can explore these 4 archetypes. And I would put it to you that these 4 archetypes of the artist's role are: 1, the alchemist spiritualist, I'll explain; 2, the radical outsider; 3, the integrated professional; and 4, not least, the court jester. So all will be revealed in a minute, but if you go through this book, you'll see that, by and large, these are the sort of northeast, south, and west of the artistic role. So let me explain, and what I'd like to do in our next sort of half an hour that we have, and then there will be time for questions, because I know you want to ask questions, is talk a little bit about each of this and get your responses of what you think. So let's start with the alchemist spiritualist. So what I mean by this is the definition of the artist as someone who puts us in touch with a hidden world, a kind of somebody who has magic powers of empathy and insight. Bruce Nauman is quoted in the book, page 272, his famous piece which says, "The true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths." And there are a number of definitions from the artist's mouths that sort of resonate with this. Laurie Simmons says, "We're alchemists who want to turn common metals to gold." Francis Alise uses the term catalyzer for the artist. Isaac Julian, a conductor. Wangechimutu calls the artist a tattletale, which is a revealer of secrets. Cindy Sherman talks about an artist being a state of mind. Marina Abramovic says, and I quote, she was celebrating her birthday outside yesterday, "The function of the artist in a disturbed society is to give awareness of the universe, to open consciousness and elevate the mind." So, is this all a bit romantic?
Well, I think artists tell stories to themselves about what they do, to give them a sense of self-belief and courage. And there are strains of romanticism that go through it. A lot of the artists you've quoted also say other things that slightly contradict the main statement. So Francis Alise, he's a catalyzer. I don't know if I'd see that as romantic necessarily. Yes, he also calls himself a midwife.
Yes, and in fact, he's also an integrated professional, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there's romance that runs I mean, I'm slightly resistant to archetypes, I guess, because I do feel like it's the way that these artists have customized the role for themselves to kind of absorb all their idiosyncrasies that is what makes them so compelling. And the moment you start archetyping, you kind of deaden them somehow. I mean, I'm interested in the way these artists enliven the myth through a whole performance, as opposed to embody static things.
Right. Having said that,
having
is the
said
artist
that, though,
a revealer of spiritual truths and having this magical
this is true.
power?
This is a very, I mean, it's a very important myth that different of these artists are tapping into in very distinctive ways. How's that?
Massimiliano, is it a myth or is it a reality?
Well, I think that the assumption of the book and what makes it quite contemporary or relevant is that the artist is not only making work or artworks, but it's performing a persona, and that is as much part of the style of the artist, no? And so obviously the construction of those myths or the appropriations of those archetypes, you could say it's simply that they are playing with the secular traditions of archetypes and myths that go back to many other centuries, and we could quote now the famous Kurz and Chris and
Kurz and Chris?
yeah,
Is it working?
I'm forgetting the title. It's the book about the myth of the artist, no? Chris Kurz and
yeah, Kurtz, Kurtz.
Yes, and if you go through this book, I think you encounter many of the archetypes that have been structured in the history of art since Vasari or earlier, no? And whether or not those are real or it's simply the artist living up to that myth, I think that's ultimately what this book is about and what art history maybe is about.
Guys, but that's exactly what I want you guys to talk about, which is, I mean, we all have spent time in the company of artists. We have experienced this feeling of, wow, these people have a perception that's very profound, and how much of that is the role, and how much of it is really that some artists have abilities that we don't. You know, like when I see a basketball player, I know I will never be a basketball player. So maybe there's some people who do have this special facility to connect to spiritual truth.
From my perspective, more than anything, it's and I guess what's also my role in the book is about is if artists do have a special talent, I think is a certain insufferance to authority, and I know this is banalizing it again, but a certain allergy to accepted notions and to accepted authorities. That I would say is the minimum common denominator that I feel, at least in my experience, and that is also what attracts me to them. No, the feeling that they can take the liberties I could never take, or they can take more liberties than me, if anything, because they are authorized to and they're expected to.
I mean, I'm interested in the various different permutations, I guess. Let's say that the alchemist, you know, Laurie Simmons is maybe one of the few artists in the book that actually uses the term alchemist, but the thought of alchemy kind of comes up over and over again. I mean, what is a ready-made if it isn't a kind of turning of common materials into gold, quite literally, when it comes to the prices paid out here in the fair. You know, Andrea Fraser is very articulate about talking about artists' fantasies. And so, you know, one of the fantasies, she sees myths as kind of very integrally related to artists' fantasies because, you know, what do artists learn at art school? One of the things they do is they absorb myths that they want to enliven. And so she talks about one of the common fantasies of artists being omnipotence, and even talks about, you know, D.W. Winnicott. Geez.
Nice Freudian slip there.
You know, and his theory that infants suffer this great narcissistic insult when they are become aware that they're not the center of the universe, and that artists cling on to this childhood fantasy. And then, so when I ask her, do you dream of being a god? She replies in a way which I think just hints, like talks about alchemy, ultimately. So I say, do you dream of being a god? And she says, maybe the way babies do when they're worshipped by their parents. One of the core fantasies of artists is unconditional love and the associated unconditional value attributed to anything that we produce. It's not, first of all, about money. It's about love, attention, recognition, regard, and freedom from shame. I mean, the kind of fantasy of creating unconditional value is an alchemist's fantasy, right?
And God bless you for asking a question like, do you ever dream about being God? Like, just having the balls to ask that question, power to you. So that's one archetype, right? So this idea of the artist as the shaman, the spiritualist, the alchemist, the connector to hidden truths. And we see how that's played out in the personae of some of these artists. The second one goes back to exactly what you were saying about authority, and this is what I would refer to as the radical outsider. This is, again, is a common image that we all have about artists, and which is in this book. The radical outsider is a more rational actor, right? This is not irrational in that shamanistic sense, but it's somebody who's a serious thinker, somebody who is outside of society, somebody whose oppositionality defines their role in society. So Zheng Fanzi says, an artist is a solitary philosopher. Martha Rosler says, a real artist is someone who has internal standards, whose standards are not defined on the outside. Wangechi Mutu again, and one can be involved in different archetypes. She says, the artists have the job of being different from the rest, which is a beautiful line. Ai Weiwei, not surprisingly in this category, he says, an artist is an enemy of general sensibilities. And speaking of Andrea Fraser, she talks at one point about her disgust for the dominant discourse. So here we have someone, it's not about some magical, clairvoyant thing. It's about a very methodical oppositionality to social norms and hegemony. What do you think?
Well, the question of being against becomes particularly difficult to be discussed on a stage in an art fair. And I don't want to, no, I think that's one of the most difficult questions that we have today. Now, going back also to the idea that a persona is a mask in a theater act, which is one of the assumptions that run through the book. The question is, at what point that becomes just a sort of empty rehearsal, and that's a question I do ask myself, and I ask myself, where do you draw the line between being complicit with the system or being against? And I think that has become more and more difficult for artists themselves, because that myth of opposition in a way doesn't exist anymore. No, the success today is based on integration, is based on price, it's based on...
It's a well-established insider role.
Yeah, and so I can't answer the question of whether or not there is a possibility of staying outside. And it's a question that also I try to raise in other exhibitions in a way, and a question for which ultimately I don't have an answer, but it's a question that for anybody who still has a soul beyond the mask, it's a question that I think should corrode our souls a little more.
You seem to have an answer.
Well, I actually think that all the artists in 33 Artists and 3 Acts are what I would call insider artists. It doesn't mean they don't occupy that radical outsider position. And I think that's a very important myth for artists, actually. There are no outsider artists in the strict sense included in the book, because as it seemed to me that the whole realm of outsider art is a different sociological world in which there are different values and myths, and a lot of the myths that, a lot of the things that are celebrated in outsider art are kind of not de rigueur at all. amongst professional artists. So the whole mode of, crazy self-expression, a downpouring, art as therapy, all of that kind of thing is, within the insider art world is kind of poo-pooed.
Yeah.
But within the outsider art world is, fantastic. So it's interesting how there are these different artist, clusters of artistic ideologies that sometimes overlap like a Venn diagram and sometimes don't. And one of the artists in the book who might fall into the outsider artist category is actually right on screen right now, Yayoi Kusama. And I think one of the reasons that she can credibly enliven that myth is because she is in her 80s.
Yeah.
And if an artist in his or her 30s was coming along, or even 20s, trying to be like the crazy genius, people might just think they were deluded.
Right.
Because there's a different place to put them now.
Yeah.
And I think that's like one of the evolutions. And just one other quick moment. I actually, I think most of the artists in the book do not think they have personas and don't identify with the term persona because it is associated with a shallow mask. And I'm interested in like the kind of the deep performance of a public self, which affects your intimate identity, I guess. And certainly some artists like Maurizio have played around with persona. And perhaps the tricksters are the ones who are most inclined to talk about having a persona.
Well, I think a very interesting character, actually probably most, the artists that most chapters are preoccupied with. There's a number of chapters around Carol Dunham, Laurie Simmons, their daughter, well known to you from HBO. And I don't know, there may be like 6 chapters about them. And, Carol Dunham is a good example. I mean, here's someone who's an enormously successful artist. His wife has been an enormously successful artist. Their daughter couldn't be any more successful. They have all the trappings and all the things. And yet, you do feel that he's not an insider. He struggles with how much time he can spend at a party, right?
I'll just add 2 notes about it. First of all, every artist, and now I'm generalizing and I'm also saying it as a provocation, every artist, probably even Picasso, at the highest of their career, will say they have not arrived yet. We all have had that experience, of artists who are having the highest recognition, the highest prices, the covers of all the magazines, and they will always complain, like they will complain about Massimiliano not inviting them to be in a show. I have worked with so many artists and with whom I think I've been the most generous, and then it happens that we speak and he say, but you didn't invite me to that show.
Venice 2013.
No, not even. We're talking like you didn't invite me to that show.
10 years ago. And I'm still thinking about it.
In the periphery of Krakow, And so again, not to fall into the stereotype of the artist as a monomaniacal human being, but they do tend to think they are outside even when they've reached the greatest recognition. And second, I think it was Laforgue himself, not the man to whom we owe the invention of the bohemian type, that he says that the bohemian life always ends in first class. So
one hope.
You hope.
Or the gutter.
He ends either with a tuberculosis and in an attic, or he ends with first class or room service all the time. So I think those are also not archetypes, but sort of recurring roles that are played out throughout art history.
And as a sociologist, I think one of the gifts that Sarah has is to be able to show that this idea of the mask is a very dynamic thing. It's an inherited cultural trope that is actualized in the behavior of these artists, who in turn create new models for us to emulate. And you sort of see this cycle happen. Let me go to the third one, which is the flip side of the outsider, which is the integrated professional, which is again sort of another dimension in this sort of toolkit of artist personae. Interestingly enough, and I don't know if this was by design, I could only really find one quote for this category. even though it should be fairly common. This is the idea of the artist as a professional. And there's a classic work of sociology by Howard Becker, which actually uses the term integrated professionals, having stepped out of the sort of avant-garde oppositionality. We now have artists who go to college, go to university, make good money, drive nice cars, etc., etc. Only one quote I could find was from Francis Alice, who says, quote, "For the first time in centuries, the artist has fully integrated social status. It is a liberal profession like it was at the time of Rubens." So why do so few...
And I think Beatriz Mijares also actually,
Who?
Beatriz Mijares
Yes.
also offers up a definition somewhat like that, although ironically, given that she is one of Brazil's most celebrated artists and the most expensive living artist in Brazil, she likens herself to a bank worker.
Bank worker.
Yeah, which is a very lovely, modest form of self-presentation. And if I can quickly find her, I'll read it to you. Here it is. Here we go. Here we go.
Come on, talk.
Yeah. So you know, she says, "I tell my friends I'm like a bank worker. I come to the studio 5 days a week and do my job. I pay attention to detail and I try not to make mistakes."
Right. Doing my job. What do you think about that?
Well, no, it's the Hemingway 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. No, that's the. I think
They're all hard workers.
I mean, the integrated
That's true.
professional obviously is also Jeff Koons' character throughout the book. Whether or not he would identify with that, but I think he is probably the artist who has the most shaped himself after a different kind of myth, which is not the opposition and more the integration. But I also think that in the specific case of Koons, first of all, it's interesting to remind that the Koons that we know today is different from the Koons of '99 that couldn't deliver his works, that couldn't finish his work because the
had budgeting
technical, that he was bankrupt, and also because the control onto materials that he had didn't correspond to his aspirations. And I think now we are used to think of him as a success story, but I think Koons' character and Koons' persona is much more complicated and much more Wagnerian than the integrated professional.
And I'll give you the quote, actually, where he likens himself to a door-to-door salesman, which I guess is
That puts him in the next category.
Well, but it's also an integrated professional, right? He says, and Koons never really answers the question directly, but the metaphors are rich, that he kind of backs into many. And this is one of his favorites that he's told to others, not just me. He said, he's talking about when he was a child, he went door to door selling chocolates and gift wrapping paper. And then he says, quote, "I enjoyed not knowing who was going to open the door. I never knew what they would look like. I was always someone who wanted to be engaged. It's the same with being an artist."
That's a good one. The book is full of really good quotes. I just want to dwell for a moment on a key aspect of artists as professionals. Your last book actually opened, as I recall, maybe it didn't open, with a crit session at an art school.
Chapter 2.
Sorry, chapter 2. We've created this vast social infrastructure to create artists in the mold of professionals. Is that a good thing?
There are many more artists making a living from their work now than at any other time in history. There are many people making a living, writers, curators, commentators, making a living in proximity to art. If you're a great lover of art, it's hard to be down on that.
For me, the experience, in a way, the dilemma of a curator, which I don't know if he emerges from the few pages about me, has very much to do with, on one hand, dreaming of working with integrated professionals, because it would make my life much easier if I could, ask for an object and get it. And on the other hand, the sort of acrobatic dances that it requires to work with artists. And I think, again, this goes back to what we were saying about, can you still be against something when you have VIP lounges? Can you still be against something when you have press releases? And I think that is, for me, today's dilemma, and I don't know if it's my own dilemma, is the hyper-professionalization of art. How much room does it leave for the unknown, for the oppositional? And again, as a curator, in a way, you could describe the curator as the worst bureaucrat whose function is actually to control the chaos that art should be. And
so you don't really want integrated professionals because they would put you out of a job.
But that would make my life easier.
Yeah,
You know, I would not
easy.
have to
Be
worry about
think
budgets or about deadlines or about
Right.
artists missing their plane or you know. And ultimately, because I love art and artists, I also want the artist to be to steal the words from a Ed Ruscha painting. I want the artist to be sand in the Vaseline. I don't want it to be the Vaseline. You know, he does have to interrupt the friction. Otherwise, it's just like any other business. And
design, it's whatever. In the interest of time, although it seems like you have another golden nugget, but maybe I should just get us to finish our 4 archetypes. So the last one is what I call the court jester. And actually, one of the quotes that I pulled out was exactly the door-to-door salesman quote. Why? Interestingly enough, some of the most successful artists in this book are the ones who provide, on self-reflection, some of the most sarcastic and self-mocking definitions of the artist, right? So Jeff Koons, calling himself a door-to-door salesman, no matter what you say, Sarah, it doesn't sound too much of an integrated professional. It sounds more like a joke to me, but I'm not sure.
He was not cracking a joke when he said
I mean,
that.
He never does. But anyway, actually the last part of that quote is, he's a door-to-door salesman who conflates virility and creativity, which we can parse what the hell that means. Then, of course, Damien Hirst, who says directly, I am an artist and a comedian. I'm a hairdresser to the stars. Is that an integrated professional? Hairdressers are professionals too,
well,
right?
if you think about an artist's relationship to Russian oligarchs, hairdressers to the stars, it's kind of relevant.
Okay. So, and finally, your friend Maurizio, who has a number of quotes, but whose persona, in a way, brings up this idea of mocking fun at even the role of the artist. So it's an interesting notion that there is, particularly among the artists who've earned the most fame and glory, there's this kind of sarcastic self-definition or self-projection. Is that internalized resentment? What is that?
I mean, the book is about belief and credibility, and it is interesting that one of the ways that you can command credibility is, and a consensus of belief is through that kind of sarcastic self-presentation. It is a very Warholian mode, I guess. You know,
Warholian.
There was a version of authenticity that kind of seemed to be dominant with abstract expressionism. With Warhol, artifice kind of kicked in, and all of those artists are playing up the artifice. And of course, by revealing the artifice, you're supposed to be in a more truthful mode. I mean, what I've found is that despite the fact that almost every artist I interview will initially say, post-Warhol, there's no such thing as an authentic artist. 3 hours into the interview, they'll be going, oh, God, he's not a real artist. It's a very hard role to perform credibly, and it's contested, and not everyone can be an artist. And the artists who've won the battle are, despite overtures to great generosity, often kind of fighting for their turf at the same time.
So Maurizio, I called him. I called you by your alter ego's name. So as someone who has on occasion stood in for Catalan and who have been part of his sort of Commedia dell'arte piece about sort of problematizing what the artist persona is, why? Why do that? Why?
Well, maybe a little background for if you haven't read the book, or for a while I would give all the interviews for Maurizio Catalan and give all his lectures, and so basically I was the spokesperson or the mouthpiece or the ghostwriter, or I don't know how you want to define it. Actually, it was often done secretly so that the journalist wouldn't necessarily know that that he or she was not interviewing Maurizio. I think the reasons why we were doing that were, first of all, it was problem solving, because Maurizio is not, he has now changed a lot, but at the time Maurizio wasn't exactly the most talkative human being you would find, and I think he felt that to be a limit of his work, or the packaging of his work. And then secondly, I think he had to do with something that we both really believe in, that ultimately artworks are, art is a form of storytelling, so that you don't really look at, obviously you judge artworks for their formal appearance, but ultimately you project, or you find in artworks stories that engage you emotionally and intellectually and personally. And so I think by having somebody else unravel these stories about his work, first of all, the works would become richer, because they became encrusted with many different narrations and narratives and stories. And secondly, we would bypass the problem of truth and authority. I think for Maurizio and for many artists, they are obviously very authoritative and they believe in authorship, but they want authorship to open up multiple meanings rather than forcing one meaning. And I think that this sort of collaboration, or this form of lying that we carried out for many years, had to do also with this questioning of the truth, and sort of suggesting that there is no such a thing as truth, but only, as we used to say by stealing words from Nietzsche, only interpretations.
I think artists are often dependent on others to develop the discourse and the words around their work, and so they will often have close curatorial friends, dealer supporters, fellow artists who help them find the words to talk about their work, because increasingly they're required to kind of do the interview, give the quote to the press release, give the studio visit tour to the group of collectors from the museum board, all that kind of thing. And one of the things I loved about Massimiliano's relationship with Maurizio was that here it had been made explicit and performed in a different kind of way. And I think that it was artists are increasingly delegating parts of the craft of their work, and I think it was exceedingly clever on Maurizio's part to delegate the verbal discourse to Massimiliano for a while, because he's exceptionally articulate,
actually,
as you can see.
Or an Italian.
And just as the artists delegate to the master welder, deploy a whole range of craftsmen in order for the greater good of the larger artwork, here Catalan has done so with his words.
Well, actually, I think many artists would benefit from your services.
Yes.
But I don't look as good as Cicciolina, which is another form of delegation.
I'm mindful of the time. I just want to see if there are any questions in the audience. Oh, good. There's no.
Well, while
Then
we're
we'll
waiting
just
for a
keep
question
rolling.
to come, and I
Yeah.
think we need to get you a mic.
Yeah.
I think it's really fun the way that you've pulled out these archetypes, because for me, I've restrained my own voice in the book from over-commenting. In a way, I like to lay it out for the reader and make it a very thought-provoking read. And so it's really exciting for me that, you've pulled these things out, which, I didn't think about it that way, but I'm so glad you've thought about it that way. And I think somebody else might come along and identify, you could very easily go through the book and find gendered archetypes,
Yes.
or, generational archetypes, and kind of slice and cut it in different ways.
I mean, and
So-
I think you should think of it as a kind of aquarelle set, different colors that could be blended together into very unique constellations of personae. The question, if you could just name your name, and if you have an institution, it's being recorded, but it's okay if you don't want to.
Catherine Hatton, and I'm an artist. And it probably is relevant that I'm from Australia, because I look at the map and I wonder how you chose which artists, and I noticed that Australia is blank, and so is New Zealand. So I just wondered why.
I have only been to Australia and New Zealand once, and I was on a book tour in which I had no time for studio visits or interviews. Actually, I did one. But I tried to make the book as international as I could. I'm lucky that the most of my travel expenses were either underwritten by The Economist or my invitations for 7 days in the art world. I got down to Santiago, Chile, and Mexico because the Spanish edition had done well, and I'd got invitations to speak. I'm Canadian. There are no Canadians. That's a little upsetting to my national brethren.
There's no Hungarians in the book.
No,
and I'm outraged.
I interviewed 130 artists for the book. Despite the book's title, there are actually only 29 artists in the book. My alibi for that is that Gertrude Stein wrote a libretto called 4 Saints in 3 Acts, and there are actually 20 saints in that libretto. So I thought if she can do it, I'll just, ride on her, borrow her poetic license. It was extremely difficult to choose the artists in the end. There were certain artists that I felt really had to be in the book, because when you ask artists what is an artist, they'll bring them up in response. So Damien Hirst, Ai Weiwei, and Jeff Koons were the kind of artists that were spontaneously mentioned. And a lot of artists measure themselves against them. Marina Abramović, too, as my research progressed for women, became a touchstone persona or public figure. And in each act, there's an artist who doesn't make a living through sales of their work and who teaches. That was very important to me. They're all professional artists, very successful artists in my opinion, but they're teaching, in one case, high school, although I just heard he got a job in a college, and the rest in universities and art schools.
Was there another question? Because if not, I have 2 more questions for you guys. One, as you just said, most of the artists in this book are well established, and yet both of you spend a lot of time with the youngest generation of artists, particularly you, Massimiliano. Insofar as these roles are kind of inherited roles, it's always up to the next generation to invent new roles. Are you seeing new patterns, new behaviors, new articulations?
I think definitely, and I saw it almost as a generational shift for people also my age. I think because of the 90s and a kind of explosion of a media system, which again somehow an art fair is an expression of, many artists my age reacted by more and more interested in different forms of communications. They were less, if you want, promotional or less sensational, and had to do more with secrets and word of mouth than with a kind of exposure that we've become accustomed to. I often use 3 examples. Trisha Donnelly, who has a show at the Serpentine, and she doesn't have her name anywhere. And it's her thing. Every time you invite her, you have to have a fight because she doesn't want to have the name on the list of artists. And another is Tino Sehgal. And these are all people literally my age, I think. Tino Sehgal, who refuses...
42?
Pardon me?
42? 41?
41 today, but...
Yeah. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Massimiliano.
Yeah.
Which seems to be
It's
actually
clap.
More importantly, is Bruce Naumann's birthday today. And
Yeah,
he's,
clap. Much older.
No, but so Tino Sehgal, for example, who refuses photographic documentation of his work, doesn't produce book, doesn't produce press releases, or somebody like Kai Althoff, who also plays this game of disappearance, which obviously all these behaviors are not necessarily truly against communication because they produce a different sort of word of mouth and a different visibility. But I think there has been a clear shift from the overexposure of Koons and Demenhurst or the self-critical media analysis of Maurizio Cattelan, Parrenaud, Pierre Huyghe, to a generation that now likes to, believes more in secrets than in than exposure.
Mm-hmm. Although I interviewed in my, my overall interviewing process of 130 artists, younger artists, in the end, I excluded them from the book because I was very keen to compare artists across cultures from Chile to China to the US to Norway or wherever. And so the book is two generations, basically. Almost all the artists in the book were born in the 1950s or 1960s. And I felt like the very young, emergent artists, it was such a different case, and they are kind of crafting very different identities. And one of the arguments in the book is that, ironically, with conceptual art, being an artist becomes a craft, and, argue that in relation to Duchamp. But yes, so the very youngest artists are maybe for the next one,
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have one more question, and I think we can fit it in, so let's do it quickly.
Hi, I'm Maritza Yos. I'm with the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and I just had a quick question about, I don't know if it's a question, but more observation. In the book, you have a lot of detail about what the artists are wearing, food, that kind of thing, in almost, I wouldn't say like tabloid, but it's actually kind of fun to have that, to have the art world get to have that kind of celebrity exposure. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I actually don't think of it in terms of celebrity, actually. One of the key sociologists that I studied while doing my PhD was Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote a book called Distinction, which is very much about how all those small cultural details are relevant to the way we are, our social background and also class background and the way we choose to position ourselves. So, people's choice of footwear or whether they're, eating a tuna fish salad or fish carpaccio with jalapeno sauce or, whatever it may be. All of these things, for me, are relevant to their sociological position in a cultural field. And so, that's one reason why all that detail is there. The other reason is because it brings things to life for the reader, and it gives the reader a strong sense of being there behind the scenes with people. And I think if you can give people a very strong image in their head, they'll remember it better. They'll remember the quote better if they can remember what the person was wearing when they said it and what the room looked like when they were there. And I think you'll find that people remember those kind of visual narratives better than they remember abstract expository arguments. Mm-hmm. And so I just hope that the content of the book sits with people for longer. And when I started my PhD, my professor supervisor said, an ethnographer has a novelist's eye for the telling detail, and I've taken that to heart.
Well, one of the great distinctions of good journalism and good sociology is great eye for detail, great eye for the big picture. Both of you give that to us every day in your lines of work. I just want to end on page 378. Andrea Fraser, towards the end of the book, is asked, what is an artist? And she said, the more you think about it, the worse it gets. I hope today we had the opposite feeling. Perhaps with your help, we had a better understanding. I want to thank both of you for coming. All of you should buy the book, read the book, and enjoy the fair. And they're outside. The books are outside. So thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the show.
Thank you, András.